unbelievably different, incredibly similar. I would pay attention to groups that are now easy to dismiss or not quite legible as forces, right? As this thing that's going to be quite impactful, but that are like where internally to the group, like the visions of the future that they're advocating for, that they're pointing towards, internally feels, unambiguously correct and self-evident and all these kinds of things. And the difficulty in prediction is how those small groups are going to interact, right? How the specific battles are going to play out, which has implications obviously on like how they shape culture, how culture reacts to it, etc.
All right, welcome to the What the Biohack podcast, powered by Bronic, to discover what the heck security means for biology. We interview some of the world's mad scientists and rad hackers across deceivingly unrelated disciplines to uncover what the future holds and how we can design against crime. My name is Dr. Miriam El-Gabri, your host, and today we're speaking with Arnaud Schenk, tech lead, used to be at Aztec, a privacy zero-knowledge protocol that brought confidentiality and scalability to the Ethereum ecosystem. We'll find out what all of that means soon enough. At some point was VP of technology at Higher Ground Education and is an instigator, which is a really cool title, at Entrepreneur First as an alumnus. But some might call Arnaud a prophet of some sort, and we'll also cover that in a second with his most recent Polaris fellowship. So without further ado, welcome Arnaud to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to speak again.
Yes, I would say long time no speak, but it's highly irrelevant in this case. With us. Okay, so to get warmed up, I think you have a very fascinating journey that I think is very well worth kind of you taking us through that and telling us how you got to where you are now. Just to get warmed up, and then I have a few questions that I'm definitely going to get kind of a smack in the hand after this podcast, but that's okay. That's why we're here. So please, take us through kind of some major incidents in your life, including the fact that, you're a high school dropout, but have really achieved a lot of things, including kind of cultivating others to follow similar or non-similar paths, but with this higher purpose and this term of becoming, which I really, really want to get into. But over to you, Arnaud.
Yeah, I suppose I'm now in the job of introducing myself several tens of times a week. So I think I have like a standard pitch, and then you can feel free to deconstruct it. So I've been in tech and startups for a bit over a decade now, as a software engineer, as an early employee, as a founder. As you mentioned, I started quite young, just a couple of years after dropping out of high school. I think there's a common theme to maybe like a lot of what I currently think about, which is how should you think about which clusters of people you want to be embedded within. I think this is something that I started thinking about implicitly after leaving school, in part because I had to, right? Like I couldn't really think maybe the standard way of thinking about the particular university or the particular companies or the particular brands I wanted to be associated with. I think I had to take a much more, here are some people that I want to go talk to, build a reputation and relationship with. And hopefully at some point that means that we get to work together, and that leads to further access or further interesting opportunities. So I was definitely doing that. I now recognize implicitly when I got started. And in 2015, I joined this company that you briefly mentioned during the intro, Entrepreneur First, when we were still very small before really we raised any outside capital. And that company's purpose is finding individuals, giving them this unconditional stipend for 3 months or so. And then if during those 3 months they start a company together, so it's mostly for technologists or people who have this maybe somewhat high likelihood of being able to start an interesting company, we fund the companies that they create. And obviously joining, you can imagine going from thinking quite implicitly about clusters of people, networks of talents, being embedded within particular peer groups or trying to be embedded within particular peer groups for myself, to joining EF, Entrepreneur First. That kind of led to a transition from implicit thinking about these topics to more explicit thinking about them. And I have not really stopped being interested in these dynamics since then. So a lot of my reading, or a lot of the kind of topics that draw my attention, are still broadly related to that nowadays. I suppose over the past maybe 5 or 6 years, so I was co-founder of this company called Aztec that you mentioned in the intro. Was there for about 3 years. We can go into detail about that experience a little bit. And over the past 2 years, so I rejoined EF in June of 2022. So was it 2023? Might be 22. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think after pandemic and lockdown, time has kind of warped. I find
a little bit,
yeah, it's very confusing. Like between 2019 and 2023, it's kind of like, is that a year, 3? I'm not sure.
Although I will also say it coincides with me getting to my late 20s. I think in kind of my teens, and when I was 19 or 20, each year seemed very, very consequential, and it still does now, but I have a slightly different relationship to them. So I rejoined EF to kind of put it into maybe practice, you might say, some of the things that I'd been thinking about talent, about networks. And the result is, or part of the result is this fellowship that you mentioned, the Polaris Fellowship, which I'm sure we'll go into plenty. So I'll skip the description.
One of the things so the first thing that you mentioned, I'm so happy that you kind of dove in straight away, is this concept of intentionality. And how to be intentional about, as you say, the people around you, and this concept of them having a direct influence in what you can or cannot achieve, essentially. One of the things that I found very intriguing was the sentence, "The expression of talent is fundamentally social." That was on the manifesto of the Polaris Fellowship kind of advertisement. So I really want to delve into that, but could you for a second just for the people that haven't read your blogs, which you have a couple or a few online, on kind of this concept of becoming, this concept of intentionality as well, education, where you kind of explain the suboptimal environment in Switzerland, correct? Can you draw us a picture? Because even in your blog, I really wanted to hear from you. Kind of, it seemed like the way to be cool there was the least amount of kind of performing with the least amount of effort put in intellectually. Like that was kind of like a insignia of, I am more intelligent than you because I can achieve all these things with like a blink of an eye. Could you draw us that picture, and like how that environment, how that led to the environment that you cultivate now, and how you pass that on to things like Polaris?
I guess the conclusion of the blog post you're referring to, that was a blog post I wrote kind of explaining joining this company that you mentioned, Higher Ground Education, which is well, we'll go into it maybe later. I still think one of the most interesting companies out there. But the conclusion of that blog post is essentially, if you care about education, if you think about it somewhat deeply, I think you can't really help getting to the conclusion that most of the time the problem that people are reacting against, I think there's partly like this naive reaction in kind of maybe idealists, right? And people who start ed tech companies or companies that hope to solve education as a problem, right? Broadly, tend to be maybe more idealistic than most. There's this sense that the job is to find this kind of point of leverage, which is going to be maximally scalable. I think you see a lot of the time these tech companies who they want to create something technological. They want to create something which kind of like solves education with the least amount of effort, right? So you see companies that are focused on being maybe infrastructure, or they want to be the place where the content is hosted, or they want to be this kind of thing that can be deployed in every classroom, but that doesn't have to concern itself with the classroom environment itself, or they want to be used by all the students in the world, right? And somehow kind of solve all these pedagogical or learning problems. And I guess when I've reflected on my own experience, I've kind of come to the conclusion that the things that I would have liked to be different in my own education were kind of specific problems at specific schools, right? They weren't, Swiss schools are, so I partly grew up in Switzerland, but relevant here is the time that I spent in Switzerland. Like, they're pretty well funded. It's certainly none of the schools that I went to where otherwise like terrible environments to be in. I mean, certainly, some fights and some scuffles and that kind of stuff as there are in every high school or every middle school.
Growing up, isn't it?
Yeah, to some extent, yeah. But
to some extent, yeah, we should say that.
I guess it feels when I again reflect on my experience, it was largely just like a particular culture that had set in for very specific reasons within the schools that I was in, and I don't think any of the tools that have been proposed over the past, say, 15, 20 years would have really made that much of a difference to my kind of disengagement with education. And I guess to your question as to what that environment looked like, it wasn't so much that it was a performance with minimal effort. I think it was just maybe a little bit of like nihilism, right, towards schooling or school, and as a result, kind of mocking the system was what was seen as like the high status, maybe, or like the cool thing to do. And what better way to mock the system than kind of passing all its tests without putting in the effort that it kind of claims to require of you. There's this like particular kind of rebellious act, right, in that. But yeah, no amount of AI assistance, no amount of kind of online platform to display curriculum, like none of that would have solved that culture problem, right? And as to how it has impacted how I think about, for example, things like Polaris, you can kind of reverse the diagnosis. If the problem with schools or these kinds of environments tend to be quite specific problems, then don't try to do things at scale, right? Just create specific environments for specific people, and don't try to think about process, or don't try to think about systematization. Just try to do your best to create the environment for the specific people that you're working with, that you think would be most helpful. That does imply that Polaris is never going to be something that's particularly big. I don't think. Hopefully, just through running it over a series of years, you get some benefits of like impact of scale, right? Just because you have more people who have gone through it after a while. But I also think that it would be a mistake to try and say, okay, well, next cohort we're doing it with 100 people, right, instead of 25. I think it's just not really what this is for. I'm very pro as a final aside. I don't want it to feel like I'm like only pro kind of the small or the kind of low scale. I'm very pro the kinds of environments that are created by, say, Twitter or YouTube, or even places like Wikipedia or various online forums that make particular like subcultures or particular pieces of knowledge very accessible. But I also don't want us to delude ourselves in thinking that these kinds of large-scale endeavors are somehow like the only lever that we have, that the ability to pull in order to create the kinds of environments or the kinds of, to some extent, people that we want to see in the world.
Yeah, so we can't apply the Twitter model to other things, and I guess in ed tech, it's a very complex, even from your single journey, right? And then if we compare it to everyone else's kind of educational path, it wouldn't scale well, perhaps, right?
Yeah, and you know, my path is certainly not repeatable, right? I don't think people should. I tend to advise people not to drop out, for example.
Yeah.
So it's not like I definitely have figured out some kind of secret, right? Quite the contrary.
Talk us through. So what was most of your education in Switzerland, and then what brought you to the States, and how did you end up in the world of kind of Ethereum? Can you kind of walk us through that journey? And I'd be curious to hear who kind of which were kind of the pivotal individuals within each of those stages, thinking of this kind of social aspect.
Yeah. No. So I was born in Switzerland. We moved to LA as a family. I think when I was maybe 5.5 or 6. Then a couple of years there. Then a couple of years in Brazil. And then moved back to Switzerland when I was maybe 11 or so, 10 or 11. And I left school at 16, so between 11 and 16 was in school in Switzerland. As to, I think at the time the only people that matter. I mean, I can maybe point to. I don't think it will mean much, but specific teachers, right? In retrospect, I'm like, oh. These people had maybe figured some stuff out, which I didn't really see at the time, and vice versa, right? There's definitely people that I now recognize were kind of just thinking about what they were trying to do in the wrong way.
In school, these individuals, like in the
I think most people just haven't. Even with good intentions, most people haven't really figured out. There's this weird thing with school and kind of teachers where, you know, what can you expect of someone who is seeing you for 2 hours a week? And to some extent, like it's unreasonable to expect them to have a particular large amount of buy-in into your success, right, or your future. Even people who do those 2 hours a week extremely competently, I think only have quite marginal impact on you. There's some teachers that go above and beyond, obviously, and kind of get you to see things that you wouldn't have otherwise seen, but I think that's quite rare. After leaving school, I spent a couple of years just not doing very much. I got a job, but it was kind of the condition for my parents to be okay. Somewhat okay with me leaving school. But that just meant that I had a little bit more money and fewer responsibilities, right? In truth, so it wasn't like a particularly productive couple of years. But around the tail end, so I had kind of been involved in maybe you might have encountered it as kind of the Juarez scene, but kind of game piracy or these kinds of things, right? Especially oriented towards, I don't know if you remember the PlayStation Portable, the PSP, as a kind of preteen or teen. I spent a decent amount of time just online in forums around, you know, the downgrade or the homebrew community in that little world. And actually, I think it was at 13 or at 14, I was a moderator for the biggest French-speaking language forum of like the homebrew community, which in retrospect taught me a lot about how to deal with people and kind of be in positions of, somewhat positions of power within communities. But through that, I had gotten a little bit of an introduction to code and to tech, but certainly wasn't thinking about, if you had asked me, when I was 16, what it means to have to work in tech, I might have pointed at like roughly something like IT, or maybe I would have pointed at, well, I kind of know that you can write software, but I was thinking about it much more, you become an engineer by getting a master's, and maybe you go work at a big company that has these requirements for software. Wasn't thinking about tech, the industry as we know it today, at all. And around 2011, 2012, I saw The Social Network. And I think that was the first thing that kind of prompted me to think about startups in this way, or tech in this way. And started attending a few kind of meetups in Switzerland, and eventually kind of decided that where it was all happening was the US. So I flew to San Francisco for a few months, and I kind of got involved with tech that way.
Okay, so that you need some sort of courage to do that lean in. How was that? How, was it after a few meetups that you realized, so something that I surely notice, especially if you compare, I don't know, networking or events, and even, I mean, it's improved, but even between London and the States, right? There's pace, I don't know, 1, and then you go to the States and it's pace 20 sometimes. One thing that I joke about a lot is I lived in Lower East Side Manhattan for a month, and it literally broke me because I could not establish kind of a routine, and the hustle was just continuous, and it kind of felt like it was exponential too, and kind of spirals out of control because you get pulled from one event to the other and you don't know when to stop. At such a young age, how was that lean in? And how did that kind of lead you into then the world of Ethereum? And I suspect it wasn't very. Was it sequential, or was it okay?
I think maybe one way to frame this, I think that there's this certainly a pretty big part of how I think about this, about these like moments, right, or these phases in people's lives. There's this weird dynamic where when you start, it's kind of ridiculous to expect that you would have good judgment as to where you're going, what it means to get there, how quickly you can get there, etc. Right? And I don't just mean this in terms of grand life plans or what have you. Even if you decide that you want to become a doctor or you want to become an engineer or what have you, you can probably think about. You have a mental model, presumably, if you're attracted to it, right? You have a mental model of what it means, like why you might want to get to head in that direction. But I think it's ridiculous to believe that you understand what it means for you to get there, right? If you were even like a first year undergrad in engineering, you don't actually know what it means to become an engineer. It feels like I don't know how this has started happening, or whether I'm like over-indexing on it, but it feels like maybe that is not something that we expose people to. This sense that they shouldn't expect to have good judgment about it, but the way you acquire good judgment is still kind of pursuing what you think is best at that moment in time. So when I look back at when I was maybe 17, 18, I think I had. In truth, in Switzerland, there's just not that many things that you can do if you're interested in tech or startups, right? There's a few meetups here and there. So there's kind of this, especially at the time, this scarcity of opportunities means that there's only a couple spaces that I could have gone into. Those spaces are spaces that I think if present me were to talk or were to consider like where I would want to go to meet people that I might want to work with or work for or what have you. Like the spaces that I gravitate towards in 2011, 2012, I would now classify as, low quality or cringe or what have you. The reason I gravitate to them is partly because they were the most visible, right? So they talked about entrepreneurship or startups and used language that was language that I had acquired that at that point, which is certainly not like what I would be looking for now, right? Anyways, I guess like the general mental model is when you're getting started, you probably have quite bad judgment about what needs to happen or how to think about what you need to do, and certainly applies to me. I think I don't think the path that I took was necessarily the smartest, right? It's not the one that I'd, like I said, recommend to people. There's parts of it that I looked into. So certainly like this idea of, well, if a lot of these companies that I'm seeing are coming out of San Francisco, I should maybe spend some time there. That worked out, right? But certainly like how I approached San Francisco, I don't think was very good, right? So
were your parents supportive of that move, or was there some sort of also like rebellious act with it, which sometimes I might argue helps. Sometimes when you see that red from rebelliousness, it kind of pulls you more forward and you kind of lean in, and you don't have enough time to think about the fear and the unknown.
Yeah, I think they were probably still a little bit concerned, but it's never cleanly one or the other. I don't think. I think I could definitely feel at the time that it was probably not what they would have preferred me to be doing. But I do think they were relatively trusting. And at the same time, just because I kind of knew that it wasn't what they necessarily wanted to see me doing, I think I put in some amount of work in convincing them that it was going to be all right and that it was the right thing to do, etc. Yeah, I guess let me think about the point that I want to make with all this. I don't, I kind of realized a few years ago that there's I think I can equally well tell the story of it was all like a series of like lucky. It was just kind of like all kind of luck along the way, and I can also probably equally well tell the story of it was all down to like agency or courage, or I had this plan that other people didn't have, or any of that, right? One that takes full responsibility for it, and one that is kind of very low agency view of how it happened. The only conclusion that I've come to is like thinking about it too much or talking about it too much is probably just this deeply narcissistic thing. I don't really know what the answer is. Like I said, I think I can tell both stories quite equally well.
I appreciate you saying that, because hindsight is a beautiful thing, and storytelling is another equally beautiful thing. So sometimes I also personally struggle when we have to, well, we don't have to, we learn, it's like a societal thing. We kind of learn how to, given the position that we are now, craft a beautiful, justified kind of story of the series of events that led us to here. We kind of pick and choose the puzzle pieces that kind of make some sort of coherent thing. And it's just a way that we've learned to quickly give a brief about, hi, this is who I am, this is where I am now because of, and it's kind of the way that we start a conversation. So perhaps not the best thing to do. I wonder,
I do think that's one of those things that maybe people who go through maybe slightly more traditional paths maybe underestimate is just to some extent one of the values of getting a university degree is it gives you this story about yourself, which is really legible, right, for the people that you start interacting with out in the world. Whether you're reaching out to someone as part of your degree, because you just want to chat to them, like being a student or being like enrolled at university is like a story that you're telling about who you are and what you're trying to do and what kind of support you might need. And similarly, post-graduation, you have this very particular label associated with yourself, which I think is like a helpful tool to be able to deploy when you're interacting with people to help them make sense of who you are. And I think that's one of those areas where I kind of lucked into. It was part of the requirements, right, of doing anything. Was I actually had to find ways to kind of tell a story about myself without that story kind of being given to me, right? I even then I think I lucked out to be going in tech during an era where there was probably an enamorment with dropouts and youth, right? I can totally imagine having a much harder time doing that nowadays when that whole story has maybe soured a little bit. But it was a very distinctive feeling of, well, of course they don't know what to do with you. Like, you're confusing, right? Like, it's not something you've not been handed this legibility factor that others may benefit from. And on the flip side, I think a lot of the advice that I give to people who are maybe still in university or about to leave university, who have gone through this more legible path, is like, well, you can still choose what story you tell about yourself, right? And how specific, what you emphasize, and what specifically the story that you want to tell is. A lot of students I interact with are maybe overly stuck on the way you get a job or the way you get access to an opportunity is through these kind of legible processes that companies or organizations put out there that you can participate in or succeed at or what have you. But the truth is, I haven't applied for a job or for an opportunity since I applied to work at McDonald's at 16, right? That's the last time that I prepared a CV. Everything else has been through I've known like a few people and talked about myself in a way that made them think of me when there was like an opportunity opening up or what have you. So it's a valuable skill to develop, kind of making yourself legible in a particular way to the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the traditional way of interviewing, I think, is completely outdated, and that's like a whole conversation that we can have another time. But yeah, I want to briefly, because I realized we were talking about Polaris and we haven't really introduced it, but before we kind of delve into that more deeply, do you want to talk about kind of how you stumbled into the world of Ethereum and like how that journey was for you, and then we can kind of full steam ahead Polaris the session out because I'm really excited about the next part.
I've noticed that question is coming back up. It was
yes, of course, I'm happy talking through it. I should say you. Yeah, okay.
So I mentioned I joined EF in 2015. Part of that was initially I got EF reached out to me to participate in these cohorts that EF runs, where you get this stipend, and if you start a company during that period of time, EF invests. Because I was initially contacted within that frame, but also because I think I had not really a deep desire to try again. I had recently had a company that I was kind of a founding team member at implode in the worst way that I think I've experienced still to this day. I was not particularly keen on starting from scratch again. So I was like, no,
How so? Are you comfortable saying that?
That's probably a conversation for another time.
That's why I delved in, I leaned in, covered my eyes conveniently.
I suppose the offer of joining a cohort wasn't appealing, but I was like, well, they seem like an interesting bunch of people, and why don't I just work with you for a little bit? So I actually joined the team, but there was always this standing offer of, at some point I probably do want to do the cohort, and we'll figure that out when it comes down to it. And that's what I did in 2017. So I actually kind of decided to leave EF, the team, and join EF, the program. And on the program, I met Tom and Zach initially, who were two of the other co-founders of what the company that eventually became Aztec. We were joined by Joe maybe a month or so later. And initially we were doing something that was kind of, and keep in mind, this was end of 2017. So I think at a time where crypto kind of had its, there had been periods of appreciation, especially in Bitcoin before this. But I think this was the first truly like, oh, this could be interesting as like a paradigm, right? Phase of the market. But it felt quite shallow to me, what was being pitched within the industry more broadly. And what attracted me to Tom and Zach is they had this very like deeply thought out view of crypto. So Tom came from a finance background. Zach was a particle physicist of all things, but a software engineer as well. And the initial thing that they had to start to work on was this syndicated loan issuance platform, so corporate debts, which has some characteristics that meant that there was a credible story as to why putting it on Ethereum was a worthwhile goal. And I joined them initially to work on that. It turns out that to do what we wanted to do, which broadly speaking was let us sell to these debt funds, these traditional finance firms, let's sell this web product to them that just happens to use Ethereum on the back end, but it's not something that they need to think about. We had some interest, but never really traction. And one of the points certainly that kind of prevented us from doing anything more was this problem of these traditional finance firms don't really want everything that they're doing to be public all the time, which is one of the characteristics of public blockchains. Everything is, part of how the blockchain validates that you're not sending money that you don't have, etc. It's just by every variable being entirely public. And so we started looking around for ways in which we could build privacy into the solution without kind of compromising this sense of, oh, this is a neutral platform, or putting it in a way that is not just putting it in a database, etc. And that took us down the path of actually rolling our own crypto, mostly led by Zach, although Professor Jens Groth was, we kind of reached out to him and got to spend quite a bit of time with him to figure out what that crypto ought to look like. And we had got a lot more traction for this thing that we thought was going to be a feature than for what we had originally built. And at this point, we kind of made this decision, the four of us, that ASEC ought to become a cryptography company, much more so than a traditional finance company. And that also meant transitioning from a very product focused company to maybe something that looked more like an R&D shop. And that was obviously very, I think it was a very interesting 3 or 4 years. I think it was like, so we made the decision maybe kind of end of 2018 or beginning of 2019 to fully kind of pivot the company. I had signed up really to be at a product-focused company. I think that's what makes me interested in building things is to kind of work with people and kind of see the impact of it. And I was finding myself essentially being in the process of writing inline assembly and doing R&D for years on end, and occasionally talking to people who the conversation basically went, well, maybe in a year we can work together, right? Which is a very different proposition to here's this thing that we're selling that we think solves this narrow problem that you have. So intellectually very interesting. Obviously, really enjoyed working with the team, but also came to the conclusion that it was just not for me, just not my kind of work. So yeah, that was kind of the transition to Ethereum. Was again, it wasn't this deep thesis, although I think I was paying attention to things that made me interested in crypto more generally for a few years prior to this. It was really a question of working with these specific people, as in Zach, Tom, and Joe, that kept me interested.
And then that brought you back to the family of EF?
Eventually, yeah. There's a couple of years in between, obviously. But so I left EF for the first time in 2017. I came back in 2021 or 2022. I think 2022. Yeah.
Oh, so did you do was Higher Ground after Aztec and then before
That's right.
Entrepreneur first? Okay. Yeah. How was Higher Ground? How did you stumble upon Higher Ground then?
Twitter.
Nice.
Yeah, just started talking to some of the team on Twitter and decide that we wanted to work together and then figure out what the role might be. And largely, Higher Ground is this organization that does essentially like very full stack they built the schools, they trained the teachers, they have in-house philosophers, they kind of developed the pedagogy. And for a long time, the only thing that they didn't do was build software. Especially for they do kind of 6 weeks old, I think is the youngest that they'll take to all the way up to high school, and they're mostly focused on early ages, but they have a number of high schools at this point. And you can imagine after maybe 10 years old or what have you, you have this slow transition to most of the pedagogical environment stops being, the physical classroom, and most of it starts becoming your computer or your the online space that you provide.
Sure.
And given how deeply opinionated High Ground is with pedagogy, it felt a little bit silly not to also have quite a lot of ownership over the kind of digital environment. And so my job was kind of help them become a company that ships software, and did that for maybe a year and a half or something along those lines. It was a bit hard because during the pandemic, obviously, so it was like a fully remote job. I had one team in Toronto, one team on the West Coast, and the people that I was working with, including Ray Gurn and Maris, part of the leadership team. Ray is the CEO, and Maris the CEO, are based in Austin. So it kind of spanned all the time zones in the US while based in London. But
you consumed the most coffee then to stay awake?
Well, no, because you start work around, I don't know, 9 or 10 a.m., right? And you just go to bed quite late. But if you talk to anyone who's had the kind of task of getting some teams to shape up, maybe as a way to put it, it's really not something that you can do. It's the kind of thing that is very high touch, and you want to, I think ideally, if I were to play that back, I want to be in person for most of that time. But obviously constrained by at the time pandemic and travel restrictions and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it was my job was mostly working with kind of building out the technology teams. They had recently acquired a couple of companies that came with some kind of technology, some software engineers, some product designers, these kinds of things. But obviously weren't those acquisitions. We're not working on things that were, actually the vision of what High Ground wanted to build. So it was figuring out, well, what needed to stay, what needed to go, how to make everything work together, essentially.
Would you say that it was kind of a combination of that work that led you to then the manifesto Polaris? No? Was that something in the making, in the back? Okay, yeah, talk us through that.
As I mentioned, I think it has been an interest for quite a few years. These kinds of networks of people that seem to be the main source of either interesting work or interesting ideas in particular eras, and this kind of small group at the same time, this kind of small group theory, right, where the people you choose, the person you choose to become is certainly not defined, but certainly like deeply influenced by the people that you're around. You can't really aspire to be something that you don't know you can aspire to. Even if you ultimately do work that is deeply novel and very weird and kind of out of what previous people, previous individuals have been able to produce. I think like the articulation of this is within the space of possibilities. I think that's something that you just get largely from. You have to be aware that that's a possibility, right? One of the founding beliefs, I think, of Entrepreneur First is if you look at Europe versus the West Coast, there does seem to be, for people who are equally smart or equally driven or what have you, just this really deep difference in aspirations, right? Where on the West Coast, it's maybe, although maybe this has changed over the past 4 or 5 years, but there was certainly a period where the default path was, well, I'm gonna maybe work at an early stage startup, or I'm going to try to start my own company, right, or something on those lines. Whereas in Europe, in London specifically, the most talented people, the kind of most driven people, the answer was something along the lines, I'm going to become maybe a doctor, or I'm going to go into finance, or I'm going to go into consulting, right? And that's weird, right? Like that's those people, it's not innate that it's not like there's fewer people who have this, I don't know, some kind of entrepreneur gene in London than on the West Coast. Largely, it's just because the culture tells you to care about slightly different things. I think that's been quite a area of interest for quite a while, and recognizing that you can actually make judgments of like, oh, well, maybe a place like Cambridge is underproducing people who are able to exploit like the technologies of startups or the technologies of venture capital in order to do the most interesting work that they could possibly do. And if you accept that fact, maybe there's this really high leverage thing to do to get them to see that actually they could be doing something else with their time and their efforts, right? So no, the Polaris in general has been on my mind for, in this fuzzy sense, probably 5 or 6 years. In this more articulated sense, maybe the past 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, what you just mentioned in terms of Cambridge, and I would argue Cambridge, Oxford, Imperial, UCL, all the kind of top universities in the UK have great research and great kind of academic publications. But if you compare those publications with, let's say, patent filings or anything that indicates some sort of exploitation of that research, it's the bare minimum. And compared to the States, for example, it's magnitudes of difference. And I think there's a recent publication, I'd say in the past couple of years, that have triggered even governmental response, especially now where the UK has this aim of being kind of a science power and investing more in science and tech, and changing those models. So I know Imperial used to have this kind of standard 30% plus of equity in any spin out coming out of the university, and now that's kind of they're trying very forcibly. I think it's really hard for them to reduce that down to create that sort of incentive structure for more innovation. UCL, I think, has been good so far with at least PhDs owning their own IP, but I can't even imagine. I think Cambridge and Oxford kind of follow suit with an Imperial model. But yeah, so definitely different cultures, and it's really admirable to see that you've been thinking about this for quite some time, and it was kind of what's it called, processing, and at some point you kind of leaned into it. So I know it took us a really long while to actually get to what is Polaris, but I think it's a great way to keep our audience kind of with us. So briefly, talk to us about what it is, how you describe it, and then I'll ask you a few more questions on how you think it went, because the first cohort kind of has finished or is finishing soon. We have our last dinner in a couple of weeks. So yeah, over to you on Polaris, first of its kind, I'd argue.
I think the best description is very simple. It's you take you put something out there that hopefully resonates only with some people. Of those people, you select, say, 20, 25, and then you introduce them to each other and you give them a bit of money, right? And if you accept that what people choose to do is partly or largely, depending on how you want to frame it, this social thing, you assume that if you introduce enough people that have certain characteristics together, you can help them enable each other, right, or radicalize each other, whichever way you want to put it. The space, so that's maybe the highest level description, maybe one of the stories that you can tell about why it matters, maybe like my diagnosis of why, like what Polaris is for maybe beyond the highest level of like, oh, we could maybe direct people to doing more ambitious things. My sense is the most interesting, well, two things. Creation, as I think we've covered a little bit so far, creation to me feels like this ideological pursuit, right? You have maybe this this inkling that there's, if you can fit a couple pieces that haven't been fit together, then something interesting happens. Or you have maybe this hunch that if you do like there's this aspect of like an imagined future that you find really, really compelling. But when you have those inklings, I think that's still quite far from action, right? And it's very easy for the spaces that you're in, even just by demanding you to explain what you're thinking about, let alone like demanding justification, to essentially stop you in your tracks, right? To basically kind of take those vague articulations of ideas and make them feel to you, even to you, as not worth pursuing. And maybe there's that's maybe the first thing, right? It's kind of if creation is this ideological thing, you need to care quite a bit around how maybe these ideological ideas kind of solidify to a point where they impel people to action. And maybe the second thing is, I think the answer to let me back up. The second thing is, my sense is a lot of the changes that we've seen over the past 30 or 40 years in universities, as in, you can take it more broadly than universities, institutions of becoming, right? Places that are attractive to talented people, and that sell in part this promise is like, we'll help you like figure out what you want to do with yourself. These institutions of becoming, I think over the past 30 or 40 years, have prioritized a certain set of things. They've prioritized openness and transparency and accountability structures and some kind of legibility, but also some kind of particular idea of diversity. And that has made the experience for the average participant better, in part because there are just more people that get access to those spaces, right? Many more university students now than there were 40 years ago. At the same time, though, I think if you're somewhere in the right tail of the talent distribution, prioritizing those ideas probably has a negative impact on your ability to kind of reach your potential. In part because of what I mentioned as the first point, right? Like, to do interesting work, you have to have interesting ideas, and you have to be able to convince yourself that those interesting ideas are worth pursuing. Polaris, one way to frame it is, let's take all these ideas that seem to have been prioritized over the past few decades and just flip them, right? Let's create small, closed off, mostly homogeneous space along particular dimensions that is low accountability, high expectation, but low accountability. And let's see what happens. And let's select people. It's not an alternative to universities. I think, ironically, I'm quite pro-university. But it's maybe something that I think is tends to not really exist anymore for various reasons, as universities have moved away from kind of being that space themselves, and also something that most of the time people, even if they diagnose the problem of universities having moved in this particular direction correctly, I think their answer is, well, it's okay because we can just devolve the responsibility of navigating that to the individual, right? If you're truly exceptional enough, you'll figure out how to navigate these problems, and it's fine. You'll kind of figure it out on your own. And I think there's a bunch of social technologies that just don't work that way, right? There's a bunch of things where if you're both the implementer of them and you're supposed to be the beneficiary of them, it just doesn't work. One of those things is privacy. I think is exceptionally hard for someone to kind of create for themselves, in part because it's exceptionally hard for someone to know when they most need it, that they do need it, right? There was a reason for, and at this point it's turning into maybe a bit of a rant, but there was a reason that for a long time I felt a little bit icky about this prioritization of working in public above all things, right? I feel like actually for a decent number of people, for people working on the most potentially most interesting things eventually, having this thought process of I'm producing things publicly as part of figuring out what I want to work on, it's just really negative, right? You probably do want people to be able to isolate themselves, but it's just not a natural thing to want to do, right? Like when you're 19 or 20, I think you kind of want some form of approval, right? You kind of you don't know whether you know how to think about what you ought to be working on, and obviously you're going to try and get feedback. And if the only spaces for feedback are these like maximally public spaces, I think you're just going to end up doing what the average person in the world thinks is acceptable to some extent, which is not a path towards very interesting work. So anyways, I think there's a set of beliefs that I still hold to be quite core to how I think about things that kind of led me to the maybe the hunch that it was worth at least trying creating these smaller, more private spaces that are explicitly, if you go, unless you know some of the fellows, I just don't know that what has happened over the past year is particularly legible or public. And I think that's a feature, right? I think largely I'm going to just let it be the responsibility of the participants to tell the story that they want to tell about what happened during the past 9 months, and leave it at that. And for the next batch, hopefully that still attracts people that are kind of have this like propensity to do to think interesting thoughts and do interesting things, but without it becoming overly legible or overly public of a space.
No, so many points there. I think in terms of how people work and how privacy can actually be a positive thing. Perhaps it's because, to your point earlier, perhaps it's because we're not equipped with this concept of needing to have the right judgment from the start, and that it's okay to not have the right judgment, and that it's okay to perhaps, like, would you describe that as being a little bit experimental as well? Because often, at least I can speak for Europe and growing up in Greece, perhaps it's this paradigm of like, you need to know from the very beginning where you want to go, and therefore reverse engineer that path to which classes you'll take today, to then get the specific score tomorrow, to then lead you to the specific university, because that university will give you the credibility for the 27th step later to get to that career that you have decided, not knowing if it even suits you, and not knowing what that means for you, and not knowing if that plays on your strengths, on your passion, or and then the second point that I'd really want to highlight that you said was this concept of ideology. And to the listeners that don't know the kind of structure of Polaris, which I wouldn't say, I'd say only a part of it has structure, which is the first few months where we actually have a syllabus, and we read certain books and discuss these kind of moments in history that have some sort of implication to community and becoming, and all the way from Christianity to, like, I don't know, counterculture, cyberculture, etc. And then and we kind of come together and talk about these, and we're given certain prompts as well to help us discuss the books, but then also kind of take it a step further and perhaps reflect, self-reflect, collectively reflect. I thought the interesting part sometimes was the collective. And I think this is the part where you're probably going to get angry at me later, but I wanted to do something sneaky, which was, if of course you want to play ball, take the first week's questions, the prompts from our kind of first cohort. And I should say, I was part of the first cohort, and I think Polaris is a fellowship that is completely different from anything that I've ever done before. Partly because it's what you said, the manifesto or the calling was completely different. It's not an accelerator. It's not an educational program. It's not even a reading club, even though we do some reading. It's nothing of the sort. I also found it very exciting that the individuals there were completely diverse. Not only, I think it was like a diversity in thinking, diversity in interest, diversity in perspectives. But that is all to say that we had also a lot of self-reflection that I think I also personally told you that these questions are ridiculously difficult. So I hope that you have already certain answers to these questions, or else this call is going to rapidly extend to kind of like a 3-hour thing rather than an hour and a half. But are you happy to play ball with me asking you the first week's questions prompts of Polaris?
Yeah, you certainly can ask them. I think I already know what my answer is going to be, but yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So the first one that I have here is, what vision for the future do you find most animating?
I guess when I said that I already had the answer for it, I think that you saw this. I think that if I take Polaris seriously, then I suppose the thing that I'm aware of is I want this to be a space that is about the individuals within each cohort, but also about their specific work, right? The more meta the space becomes, the less interesting it is. And one of the ways it can become an uninteresting space is because if it becomes about me, right? Which is why quite a few of the dinners I just didn't attend, and why there was a fellow who was kind of the person responsible for organizing things, and it wasn't me. And to some extent, for some of these questions, I think I could probably answer them for myself, but maybe I'll preface them at the very least with I don't think it's that interesting to index that heavily on my own answers, right? That's kind of the thing that I want people to avoid. Part of the readings is hopefully to get to see patterns which help you figure out what you think about what you ought to be doing with your time, with your efforts. There's this weird thing where you can both recognize that the expression of talent is this fundamentally social thing, and also recognize that the people that do the most interesting work build up this particular resistance to social influence, right? So you kind of have to hold those two things together at once, if that makes sense. I don't know if that that also doesn't answer the question that you asked, but
no, knowing and having been through the course, that's a completely fair response. Yeah, and in hindsight, I think I and I guess a bunch of fellows from the cohort are just purely interested, but I guess this isn't the means to what's it called, the platform to do it, and that's completely fair. Because if anything, it might ruin it for the next cohort, right? But one thing I will cheekily ask anyway is there were 2 cohorts. I mean, I know the answer to this, but I kind of want to see how you're going to respond. There's 2 cohorts: the London one, Cambridge one. We know who was better, right? Was that like a this is me, Arnaud, this is me. I'm always going to ask these questions. You don't have to respond. Was there like a social experiment to that, or was it purely to perhaps like test an assumption of the type that you said earlier, which is to try and build educational platforms that are more specific to the environment? Because I know, like, at least initially, we didn't have a lot of mixing between the cohorts. So I was just curious about that.
I think it's very easy to read more conspiratorial thinking into things than there actually were. You know, I do definitely accept and almost want to say, like, I do think that it's important to think somewhat conspiratorially about what you're doing. You know, to some extent, I think if there was more clarity over part of my refusal to answer, or refusal, part of the reason I think it's not, I'm not inclined to answer your previous question is like, I certainly have perspectives on all these things, right? And like I have goals with doing what I'm doing, which they're not secret because they're dangerous or bad or what have you, but just in part, I think sharing them explicitly maybe makes it less likely that I'm able to act on them, right? To some extent. But on this particular question, there was no conspiracy at all. It was part of the decision was universities are, I think, bad at fostering a particular kind of talent. They're still very good at aggregating very talented people. And solving the aggregation problem and solving the fostering problem are two very difficult and different problems. I don't know, like solving just the fostering problem, which is kind of how you can frame Polaris, is already difficult enough. I think I still haven't figured it out, right? It's not something that still something I'm in the process of figuring out. And adding the problem of aggregating people, I think would have been a step too far. It would have just kind of confused things. So the idea was, well, you know, let's just be parasitic on top of universities, let them do the aggregation, and we'll just create a subspace essentially. And what are two quite good university clusters in the UK? One is in Cambridge, one is in London. I happened to meet two people that I think would be good kind of bootstrappers for these spaces, the two community leaders. And that was that. We did one in Cambridge, one in London, but there was no big like complicated plan. If anything, what I'm signaling is doing the, you know, a lot of it was opportunistic, which I think is just generally how things happen in the world. You have to be slightly opportunistic about things.
Is there anything you do differently in the next one? And we should say, is the next one both in London and Cambridge, or just okay, cool.
Both in London and Cambridge. The main changes it will be during the kind of project phase, as you mentioned. There was very, very little structure. I'm not inclined to add much more structure than there was, but there is now, you know, 50 or so people that have experienced some of the difficulties with kind of choosing what to work on in this highly unstructured way, and having those alumni be involved as the next batch figures out what they want to be spending their time and resources on. I think that's something I'm very keen on. It's just not entirely clear to me that adding kind of more structure and more process would lead to better outcomes, but certainly involving people who have recently had to think about these very same problems, that seems just undeniably productive.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there something specific that you're especially kind of proud of coming out of the first cohort?
I think that the fellows have, you know, I stopped being actively involved in getting people to attend or kind of structuring interactions or what have you very early on. I think the cohorts bonded quite well and quite organically. And I think that's one of the most important component pieces to that is trust develops and kind of respect and like a desire to work together develops. I think we're still maybe a little bit a ways from seeing the kind of consequences of that, although I think there's some quite exciting things happening. Again, I don't think it's my place to share them, but I'm quite happy with that. I think primarily it's just the relationships that the fellows have formed.
Cool. Okay, this is kind of like a future thinking question that I always like to ask my guests, and I help, but not too much. So here we go. It's 2073. You need to describe our society in 10 words. And the way that I help, of course, is helping you count those 10 words, but everything else is on you. What does our society look like for you, for Arnaud?
What kind of, what are you looking for? Are you looking for, I have a sense for what the kind of maximally, or it's less risky, but what does society look like? What parts of society?
For you to define, for you, this is kind of a flavor of Arnaud in the response. Nothing to do with Miriam. More kind of futures thinking exercise. And it can be like a 10-word, it could be like a sentence, so it's like the 10 words in that sentence, or it could just be words that kind of help paint that picture. I've had both.
Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is quite trite answers, but I'll spare you those.
I can almost feel like you're visualizing this. I can feel like a picture forming.
Well, the truth is, like, I'm trying to think about how to articulate because this obviously touches on some of the things that we discussed during Polaris, right? How you should think about what to pay attention to now. That might be important, might turn out to be important in future. So I'll give you one of the tried answers, but I don't think you'll be satisfied with it. And I'm very happy to revise it. One of the tried answers is maybe something like unbelievably different, incredibly similar, something like that.
Oh, nice.
But I don't think that's particularly useful of an answer.
That's 4 words too. You kind of went, hey, give me a challenge. I'll make it even more difficult.
I guess if I can share what's happening, what I'm thinking about, I think there's if you I would pay attention to groups that are now easy to dismiss or not quite legible as forces, right? As this thing that's going to be quite impactful, but that are like where internally to the group, like the visions of the future that they're advocating for, that they're pointing towards, internally feels, unambiguously correct and self-evident and all these kinds of things. And the difficulty in prediction is how those small groups are going to interact, right? How the specific battles are going to play out, which has implications obviously on like how they shape culture, how culture reacts to it, etc. I think I can maybe make a list of some of the small groups. So some are larger than others, but you can always deep dive to kind of a particularly productive part of the larger ones. So you obviously have kind of degrowth as one. You have maybe pro-growth as its opposite. You have various subsections within each, but I think both are like easy to dismiss for various reasons, or not quite legible as groups yet. But I think they are. They definitely are. Obviously, you have particular startups, particular technology companies, which are undeniably going to shape how we experience the future, but maybe in ways that is so gradual that we don't really notice it. And also, by the time you get to kind of 50 years, one of the things to think about is Apple started in 1976. They're coming up to their 50-year anniversary. By the time the internet came about, they were already 24 or 25, right? Really, and I'd argue that certainly if you were looking in 1976, basically no one saw Apple as worth considering. 1978 is when the first venture capitalists, beyond kind of a single angel investor, started paying attention to Apple. At that point, started becoming hot, but it started becoming hot in this quite narrow way, right? Where there was this maybe gradual realization that a particular kind of computing was interesting. It was kind of growing, and you could sell things to that market, etc. But I think it'd be ludicrous to claim that in 1978, 1979, even Apple itself realized what the path that it was on was, right? And I guess to some extent, you could argue that if you took Apple really, really seriously, you could have glimpsed parts of the future. But I don't think that there's any extrapolation of what they were currently thinking about or currently working on, which would have given you like a particularly precise view of things, right? So personal computing obviously happened, or is still happening, but the form in which it happened, I think, was largely invisible to people, and the form matters a lot, right? How people imagine personal computing to shape society is very different to, I think, what society looks like now. Certainly, we still haven't kind of solved for the equilibrium, right? We're still not stable in that way. One of the things is like, okay, well, personal computing was supposed to be this like deep empowerment thing. It was going to help people educate themselves, help people acquire power, etc. You could argue that it actually has largely been a centralizing force, but also clearly destabilizing, right? It's not like the world is more hierarchical or more ordered than it was previously. But certainly, states and large companies do have can have more scale, more reach than they did previously. I guess I'm tempted at pointing at the pattern that profits tend to be fundamentally correct and fundamentally wrong, and that you kind of have to, if you dismiss them out of hand, you're probably not going to see a particularly correct version of the future. But also, if you believe them outright, you're also probably not seeing how the future is actually going to play out. And so, beyond pointing out or pointing out like you should pay attention to groups that you're likely to dismiss nowadays, because those are the ones that might shape things going forward. I don't know that I would be confident in my ability to predict how it's all going to shake out.
Do you think that there are some either companies or technologies that would have had a larger impact, or that will have a larger impact? Because as you say, it kind of takes time, that have been kind of not justified or encouraged through kind of financial incentives. So the typical thing is that the market knows all, right? But the market might, the tech might be too early for the market, right? There's a user kind of a adoption cycle. Is there so do you think that holds true? And is there like a specific company or technology that you have in mind, or an inkling that it's either too early, or it's been stalled, or it doesn't have like a commercial standing now, but might have a huge implication tomorrow? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Just because we were talking about Apple, I mean, truly the Apple. So what was produced in 1975, 1976, the Apple I, didn't have a market in truth, right? They convinced a particular shop to carry computers. What they delivered were actually kind of naked boards. When the shop thought that it had bought kind of full terminals. And so there was a mad scramble to kind of hire a cabinet maker to create like wooden housings for these boards with a keyboard, so that it could be seen as a more full-featured computer. But those didn't sell at all, right? What did happen, though, is there was maybe sufficient narrative at that point to be able to draw in Makula, was the first angel investor in Apple, or first real angel investor in Apple. It's one of those things where, yeah, of course, timing matters and go-to-market matters, and part of your job as a founder, if you're going to be successful, is not to believe too much in that the world is this kind of largely fixed. It's not that it's largely fixed, but it's kind of like that you're this kind of you're subject to the world to some extent, right? And I don't want this to come across as trite, but to some extent, founders who work on things that where they basically say like, oh, we were too early. I think you can kind of point at the fact that it's a skill problem, right? It's not actually some kind of feature of the world that it's too early. Figuring out what you can get away with, what you have the ability to act on, what allows you, like what you're able to do now that allows you to do the next thing. Like all those are some of the skills that make you a good founder, or kind of point you in the direction of being a good founder. And I guess maybe to some extent, I kind of want to, it's not quite reject the premise, right? But I think there's a bunch of companies where if you just look at almost like an efficient market hypothesis view of Apple, is like not a good company, right? It didn't need to exist. 1976 to maybe early 1978, it's like, this is a failure. Apple is obviously, we have a very different view of what Apple is now compared to what it was then. But if they had started with the iPhone, right, it would have been a skill issue. Like they clearly wouldn't have been working on the right thing. It wouldn't have allowed them to take the path that they eventually were able to walk. And you, in fact, have this, again, don't want to over-index on Apple. There's plenty of examples, but just because we're speaking about them, I think you can point to what came after the Apple II, kind of early 80s with them, as largely them forgetting that they didn't have like a God-given right to succeed, right? When you look at maybe like the Apple III or the Lisa, or the kind of iterations on the Apple II. The Apple II was in shops for like half a decade or a decade, and kind of largely sustained them. Again, I feel like there's something about this kind of question of like, ooh, what are companies or technologies that could have succeeded if the world had been different? Like largely, my opinion is like those are the wrong companies to start, right? Like you as a founder need to find the sweet spot where you can survive today while being led by a vision for what could happen tomorrow. But confusing the vision and the strategy is just a recipe for death, right? It's not a recipe for interesting work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with that kind of notion. And I wonder, yeah, because sometimes people stop and only think about the technology, but not the storytelling, not the
fundraising and the customers, right? And like you have to like, part of why the job of being a founder is difficult. Well, two things maybe. One is it's quite hard to just think about those things all at once. But second, it's quite a lonely proposition, right? You're basically having to always maintain a story that you're telling out there, which you're maybe more confident. You need to appear more confident in your storytelling than you actually are. And largely, you don't have anyone who can come back and raise your spirits, right? Largely, it's just kind of your own steadfastness that gets you there. I think working on the right thing at the right time, that is part of the skill, right? It's not a world issue, it's a skills issue.
To quickly flip this question though, do you think that the inverse also holds true, or holding Yeah, I'm not sure because I'm also going through that question in my head, but also going, working towards the technology or the vision that you have. Is the kind of opposite scenario also true? Where are there instances where just sticking to the technology for a longer period or trying to pursue it, kind of the I won't say the wrong path to take, but is there a point where you kind of have to cut your losses?
Difficult to say in the abstract. I guess that's again,
and also cutting losses or pivot.
Yeah,
right.
Again, like just very difficult to say in the abstract. I think some companies go on for too long. Some companies quit too early, and some founders are too receptive to market feedback, and some founders are not receptive enough, right, or don't seek it out enough. In the abstract, I think if you kind of boil all of that in some kind of abstract set of a piece of advice, you largely end up with understanding things. I think that's kind of the fault of things like the lean startup, right, or what have you. It claims that, oh, if you follow this method, you will come up with the right answer. But actually, like, the uncertainty is yours to resolve, right? Like there's no part of what you're doing in starting a company is you're trying to find answers to questions that no one really has an answer to, right? Even sometimes that people haven't really asked yet. It's ludicrous to believe that there's some kind of process that has been kind of figured out prior to you starting, which also could get you to the answers that you truly need to get to. If that was the case, then you wouldn't be engaged in the process that you think you're engaged in, right? If you're working on a startup, you're partly trying to find some truth that other people haven't found yet, and I think that precludes most processes or most like frameworks or most pieces of advice from being that valuable. That doesn't mean like dismiss all tacit knowledge, right? That doesn't mean like completely reinvent everything from scratch. And in fact, that's the problem. You can't be at either extreme. You can't be I will doubt everything, or you can't be at I will just take this unquestioning. Where you land depends like moment to moment, and one of the many reasons why being a founder is difficult. Like it's actually an epistemologically difficult problem to confront yourself to, right? You actually have to figure out what is it that I know about the world, and what do I need to know, and what do I want to know, and what is truth, right? to some extent, not to be overly grand about it. But maybe in summary, I doubt abstract lessons about startups. I think they're largely not very valuable.
That is a great way to end this podcast, and I think it will be very encouraging to a lot of founders and just individuals out there that are kind of in the process of ... So thank you so much, Arnaud. I think like we've just warmed up now, and I think we can talk for hours on end after this. So I'm gutted that I have to kind of end this podcast now, but I'm sure we're going to invite you on again. Thank you so much for your time and sharing kind of your experiences. And I apologize for kind of prodding you in places where
That's
maybe
right.
you didn't want to be prodded.
No, not at all. I in turn apologize for. I think essentially when you listen back, I think you might find that I've not actually answered any of your questions, which is quite a rude thing for me to do.
It is such a good skill. But what I am super excited about is what's yet to come out of Polaris, and so I'm going to be very tuned in, and I will share all the links for interested individuals as well. So thanks again, Arnaud.
Thank you, Mary. Bye-bye.